December 25, 1944. Dawn clawed its way through frozen clouds over the Ardennes. The sky was jagged with wind and steel. German Luftwaffe Staffelkapitän Dietrich Kessler squinted into the pale morning as his Bf-109 climbed through the mist. His unit had orders: locate American fuel columns near Bastogne and strike them before the Wehrmacht advance stalled. There were 64 aircraft in the group, a tight wedge of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, black crosses gleaming against the frost. They had been told the Americans had no meaningful anti-air defense in the area. The weather had grounded most Allied aircraft for days. Now, under partial clearing, the Germans saw their opportunity. Kessler's squadron was confident, cocky even. They had strafed columns before. The Americans below always scattered like ants. But as they broke through the cloud deck, Kessler noticed something strange. The sky ahead was shimmering, not with planes, not with flak bursts. Something else. Tiny specks motionless, no arcs, no trails, just silent dots suspended in the air. "Verdammt, what is that?" he muttered. Then everything detonated at once. A sphere of fire engulfed the lead element. Bf-109s vanished in midair. No warning, no tracers, no time to bank or climb, just obliteration. A dozen aircraft vaporized in the span of a heartbeat. Kessler dove, screaming into his radio, but the radio was static. Another blast cracked off his left wing. A second squadron was gone. The sky had become a minefield. Except this wasn't flak as they knew it. This wasn't timed. It wasn't aimed. It was aware. The 90 M3 anti-aircraft gun with the VT proximity fuse, the variable time fuse, had just introduced itself to the Luftwaffe. And it did not miss. The weapon had arrived quietly. Buried in snow-dusted tree lines, American flak crews had waited for days, the barrels of their M3s coated in frost, ammunition cans stacked in drifts like tombstones. Each gun was fed from a cache of rounds tipped with a secret the Germans had never seen: a miniature radar transmitter, calibrated to detonate the shell when it passed within 70 feet of metal. They had called it VT, a boring name for a weapon so diabolically precise it could erase an aircraft with a single near miss. Sergeant Harold Gibbs manned one of the batteries near Bastogne. He'd spent the past week buried in snow, eating frozen rations and praying the skies stayed cloudy. But on Christmas morning, the overcast began to peel back. When the first German formation punched through the clouds, Gibbs, fire director, didn't hesitate. Fire for effect, VT rounds only, burn the sky clean. The 90 guns thundered. Not a scattered barrage, not a guessing game, this was guided judgment. Each shell screamed to altitude, scanned the air, and then, if it sensed a plane within range, exploded in a blossom of fire and shrapnel precisely when it could do the most damage. To the German pilots there were no muzzle flashes to dodge, no black flak puffs to steer around, no delay. 1 second the sky was clear. The next, death bloomed invisibly. Kessler fought to regain control. His squadron had started with 20 aircraft. Now 7 remained. His voice was hoarse from shouting into a dead radio. No formations, no orders, just survivors scattered through a sky that had turned against them. Pull back now," he yelled. But the only answer was another mid-air detonation as a nearby Focke-Wulf spun into fragments. They couldn't see where the fire was coming from. They couldn't fight it. There was no tracer path to follow, no smoke to aim at. Just sky and silence and sudden death. Below, Sergeant Gibbs reloaded. The breech hissed as a new VT round slid home. The loader was fast now, practiced. Each battery fired 4 rounds per minute. 12 guns, 48 VT shells every 60 seconds. Each one a guided whisper of destruction. The proximity fuse had begun as a desperate gamble. Designed in labs under crushing secrecy, It used miniaturized radar components to determine proximity in flight. The concept was so advanced, American generals had feared the technology might fall into enemy hands. It had been used sparingly, first against V-1 buzz bombs, then on ships in the Pacific. But now here, over the Ardennes, it had been unleashed in force for the first time in Europe. Kessler's pilots were discovering it the hard way. They had trained to dodge timed shells, to roll out of flak zones, to outclimb artillery arcs. But you could not dodge a weapon that knew where you were. North of Bastogne, another Luftwaffe group came in low, skimming the treetops to avoid radar. They never saw the shells. They never heard the guns. The air erupted. VT rounds detonated in patterns calculated by sound ranging and radar predictive tracks. The Germans were flying into pre-written death. Within 3 minutes, that formation was gone. A corporal at the battery site shouted over the radio, half laughing, half shocked. "They're not even getting past the river. We're killing them before they see us." Gibbs didn't respond. He was watching the shells land, watching the fireballs in the sky. He knew what it meant. The Luftwaffe had just been blinded. What Kessler saw below him was chaos, burning wrecks in the snow, dozens of crashed planes smoking in open fields. He managed to pull out with 2 others, trailing oil and smoke toward the east. When he landed, the airfield was silent. Mechanics stood motionless. Officers stared at the sky like it had betrayed them. He climbed out of the cockpit and looked around at the blackened clouds. What did we just fly into? No one answered. But far behind the lines, in an American battery dug into the ridge above Bastogne, Gibbs wiped snow from his helmet and looked to the sky. They said the German Air Force was still a threat, that if the clouds broke, the panzers might roll again. But now they'd seen the future. They didn't need to shoot at the Germans anymore. The sky itself had become a weapon. The sky never healed after that morning. Over the Ardennes, the clouds thickened again by noon, but not before the news spread like smoke through the Luftwaffe's forward bases. Entire squadrons had vanished. No wreckage retrieved. No enemy aircraft seen. Just silence followed by loss. At Jagdgeschwader 11's temporary field strip outside Prüm, ground crews walked the snow-caked perimeter in disbelief. Oil slicks covered the boots of the mechanics waiting to service aircraft that never returned. Major Otto Reinhardt stood with his flight engineers in the hangar mouth, clutching a cigarette that had burned down to the filter. He hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. His wing had lost 16 planes in 2 hours, all of them veterans. Some had over 70 missions logged. The word on everyone's lips wasn't flak. It was something else. Something darker. "Unseen, it hits when you pass through it," one mechanic muttered, "like flying into a ghost with teeth." Reinhardt crushed the cigarette into the snow and walked away. He'd seen war. Russia, France, Italy, but this wasn't war. This was execution. Far from the field strips, in a snow-covered orchard near Bastogne, the American 9-beam batteries were digging in again. Sergeant Harold Gibbs crouched beside a radio crate, sipping lukewarm coffee from a tin mug. His gun crew had stopped firing for now. The skies were once again buried under cloud, but their listening posts were alive with chatter. Confirmed hits on 7 groups this morning. Signal intercept says German command grounding flights south of St. Vith. Recon units spotted crashed birds from a second wave. One group didn't even get within visual range of the front. Someone near the ammo stack whistled. They never even saw us. Gibbs didn't smile. He remembered the faces of the Flak crew, some of them kids barely 20, cold, shaking, grease on their cheeks. They weren't trained killers. They were Iowa farm boys with 6 weeks of training. But with the VT fuse, it didn't matter. Now every round they fired had the instincts of a hawk. The development of the VT fuse had been one of the most expensive and secretive efforts of the war. The British had helped with the early theoretical groundwork, but it was American engineers who cracked the problem. How to build a miniature radar inside a 9-beam shell, one that could survive the stress of 20,000 G upon firing, then scan its surroundings midair. The fuse contained a vacuum tube less than 3 inches long, a tiny battery, and a signal circuit that could detect reflected radio waves from aircraft skin. It didn't detonate on impact. It didn't wait for a timer. It listened. And when it got close enough to metal, within 70 feet, it triggered. The effect was devastating. A single shell didn't need to hit an aircraft anymore. It only had to find it. For the German pilots, the shift was imperceptible at first. They launched another raid on December 27th, this time from Luftflotte 3, a coordinated strike of over 90 aircraft. Their mission: punch through to the Meuse and hit the bridges supplying Patton's Third Army. They flew in 3 tight waves at 15,000 feet, altitude, speed, discipline, all precise. The cloud ceiling had lifted just enough. At first everything looked good, flak was minimal. But then the bursts began again, not like normal. No black smudges hanging in the air, no visible arching shells. Just flashes. Mid-air, right inside the formation. The center group disappeared first. 6 planes shredded simultaneously, not from collision, not from fire, just obliterated mid-maneuver. The rear wave scattered. Panic rippled across the radio frequencies. Eagle 3 braking left. Something S in the air, something S. Gott im Himmel, it's static. Then another pop, clean, tight, like a distant firecracker. Flames spiraled out of the clouds. On the ground, American fire control officers tracked the bursts with stopwatch precision. Radar plots fed predictive vectors into analog computers the size of wardrobes, and the data fed the guns. Sergeant Gibbs watched through a spotting scope. A single German plane broke from the upper formation, diving hard, banking to starboard. Smart move, or it would have been. The gunnery officer clicked his tongue, shells already in the air. Gibbs didn't even look up, he just listened. There was no whistling arc, just a deep thud in the air, more felt than heard, and then the 9-beam shell exploded just ahead of the banking fighter. The Messerschmitt flew directly into the cloud of steel. It emerged, then began to wobble, smoke, a wing snapped, then it vanished into the tree line. No cheers, no clapping. Just another round loaded. By January, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 aircraft in the skies above Belgium and Luxembourg. Not to Mustangs or Thunderbolts, but to invisible killers. Some pilots refused to fly unless cloud cover was absolute. Others began demanding escort by Me-262 jets, though the speed made coordinating impossible. The flak guns didn't care how fast you were. The moment you entered the altitude bracket, they listened. They found you. And they waited. Kessler, grounded since the Christmas morning ambush, was summoned to a staff conference near Bonn. A colonel from Berlin briefed the assembled officers with a trembling pointer. A map stretched across the wall. Dozens of red XS marked assumed crash zones. The colonel's voice was dry. It is not conventional flak. They are detonating shells near our aircraft, not on impact. A general leaned forward. You're saying they're using radar inside the shell? Yes, sir. Laughter short, sharp. That's absurd. That tech is years away from being battlefield ready. Kessler didn't laugh. I've flown through it, it's very ready. Silence. The general straightened. So what do we do? The colonel paused. Pray for clouds. Back in Bostonia, the Americans kept firing, but only when they had to. The VT fuses were precious, expensive, complex, fragile. But when needed, they worked like nothing else. By late January, command centers across the front began to reassign resources. More 9mm guns were shipped in. Artillery units once meant for field work were redirected to anti-air roles. The Allies had realized something crucial. The Luftwaffe didn't fear the air anymore. They feared the silence. They feared climbing to altitude and not knowing if they were being watched. The VT Fuse had done something rare. It had changed behavior. And in war, behavior is everything. Reinhardt's last flight came on January 15th. He led a mixed unit of 12 aircraft over a ridgeline east of Hufvudstaden. The weather had cleared. The sky empty. He tightened formation. They moved fast, low, banking into the approach route. Then one of the tail aircraft vanished. No sound, no explosion, just gone. Seconds later, Reinhardt's canopy cracked. A shockwave, invisible, precise, struck his tail rudder. He spun. The sky wasn't empty. It was hunting. There was a phrase spreading through the Luftwaffe squadrons by late January. It wasn't official. No officer had written it into a report. No general dared speak it in briefings. But the pilots whispered it to each other, low and bitter. Der Himmel gehört Amerika. The sky belongs to America. In Luftflotte 3's command barracks west of Köln, Captain Rolf Eberhardt leaned over a field map pinned to a splintered wooden table. His gloves were still soaked from flight. He tapped the map with a pencil, tracing where his Staffel had tried to cross the Aar River 2 days earlier. "We came in at 14,000 feet, he said flatly. Clouds parted briefly. We didn't see muzzle flashes. No flak bursts, but we lost 5 aircraft in 9 minutes. A colonel across the room adjusted his spectacles. Were there enemy fighters? No, just, Eberhardt exhaled slowly, just sky, then fire. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Outside, in the snowy Belgian countryside, American radar technicians leaned over cathode ray displays glowing green in the dark of their mobile trailers. Blips moved slowly across the scopes, tiny echoes of metal slicing the air above the horizon. One operator adjusted the gain. Looks like another recon flight out of Bonn. 24 birds, maybe 3. The fire control officer, a major from the 555th AAA Battalion, nodded and lifted a field phone. Battery able, stand by to engage. VT rounds only. 12 miles away, on a hill surrounded by skeletal trees and blasted stone walls, the M390 guns adjusted by degrees. Crews moved with synchronized rhythm. Set elevation, crank azimuth, check fuses. VT shells confirmed. The major's voice was calm. Let them come, don't spook them too early. Captain Eberhardt's flight broke cloud cover and leveled over the frozen forest south of Malmedy. He could see nothing but ridges and ruin below. No columns, no tanks, but their orders were clear. Recon the road net, identify logistics lines for tomorrow's artillery. He kept the formation tight, staggered pairs, old habit from Russia. Then the man on his right vanished. 1 second his wingman was there. The next he was, no smoke trail, no engine fire, just gone. Eberhardt flinched, his gut clenched. He turned to radio a warning. Then the man behind him exploded. A wave of heat slammed through the cockpit. Shrapnel cracked his canopy. Eberhardt dove, teeth gritted, heartbeat exploding. Break formation, drop altitude, he screamed, but he couldn't even hear himself. He passed through a cloud at 9,000 feet. And 3 more aircraft were erased before his altimeter hit 8,500. On the ground, the American gunners smiled grimly. Jesus, one of them muttered, it's like the skies playing piano with their wings. Gibbs didn't answer. He was too busy loading another round. His hands moved fast, practiced, but his mind wasn't on the shell, it was on the silence between detonations. The moment after the fireball, when the Luftwaffe pilots realized they were inside a box with no door. The VT fuse had changed more than air defense. It was reshaping how the Allies thought about space itself. Altitude was no longer a refuge. Clouds no longer concealed. Radar, which once guided interceptors, was now feeding artillery. It was war without a face. A private's hands could kill a pilot he never saw, never heard, never hated. And for the Germans, that kind of enemy was unbearable. In an underground hangar near Kassel, engineers and officers gathered to review flight data. They pored over scraps, telemetry, crash reports, partial audio logs. None of it made sense. "They're not firing flak at us anymore," one analyst said. "They're putting it near us, around us. It's predictive. It's intelligent." "No," another said softly, "not intelligent, just automatic." At the front, the remaining Luftwaffe units adapted. They flew lower, below radar sweeps, through valleys and riverbeds. But that brought them into range of small arms and mobile AAA. Some squadrons switched to night missions, only to find that American radar didn't sleep either. One Staffel attempted a dawn sortie on January 26th, targeting a supply depot near Liege. They never reached it. The flak came from nowhere. 12 out, 3 returned. One of them, Lieutenant Klaus Römer, had blood on his helmet and shrapnel in his thigh. He crawled from his cockpit, collapsed in the mud, and whispered to a medic, "They don't even see us anymore. They just listen." By February, Allied flak batteries had integrated the VT fuse across most major air corridors. Anywhere the Luftwaffe flew, Belgium, Luxembourg, even the edges of the Rhine, they risked flying through invisible crosshairs. Not long after, British intelligence picked up intercepted chatter from the German High Command. One line stood out: "Do not assume low resistance in sectors with no observed fire. Assume total coverage." That was the new battlefield, not trenches, not bunkers. Just a listening sky. Eberhardt didn't fly again after February 4th, not because he was injured, not because he was grounded. He simply refused. He spent 3 days alone in the maintenance shed, staring at the fuselage of a wrecked aircraft. He ran his fingers across the jagged aluminum, tried to piece together where the shell had struck. But there was no impact, no entry. Only holes and vapor and heat. He filed a false maintenance report and spent the rest of the war training new pilots who he knew would die. Because he no longer believed in air superiority. Not when you could be killed by silence. Behind the guns, the men of the 555th watched the skies grow quieter. By late February, sightings dropped by half, recon flights thinned, bombing raids halted. One night, Gibbs leaned against the muzzle of his M3 and stared at the stars. "It's like they gave up," he muttered. A gunner next to him shrugged. "Wouldn't you?" They didn't fire a shot that night. But the sky was theirs. And everyone knew it. It wasn't just the kills, it was the silence between them. By mid-February 1945, the number of German air missions over the Western Front had dropped to levels the Allies hadn't seen since the earliest days of the war. Recon flights were sparse, fighter patrols nearly non-existent. Bomber raids had become suicide notes. Yet American gunners kept their fingers near the triggers, because the sky, now theirs, demanded vigilance. In a barn-turned barracks outside Hufvudstaden, Sergeant Harold Gibbs listened to a new batch of replacements arrive. Green kids, barely trained. One had a Wisconsin accent so thick it made the sergeant chuckle for the first time in weeks. But when Gibbs laid out the ammo crates, each marked VT handle with care, the laughing stopped. "You'll only get 3 shots a minute from a good crew," he said, slapping the crate. "But you won't need more than that." The newcomers looked confused. One finally asked, "So, how close do these shells need to get?" Gibbs glanced up at the slate-gray sky, close enough to hear you breathe. In a dim flight shack outside Koblenz, Hauptmann Reinhardt stared at the chalkboard tallying available aircraft. Only 13 names remained. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't fuel shortages, it was something worse. A staffer entered quietly, dropping a sealed report on the desk. Reinhardt broke the wax, unfolded it slowly. All reconnaissance flights south of Cologne, suspended indefinitely. New instruction. Any confirmed American 9-deam AAA position with VT capability is to be avoided at all costs. He set the paper down, chest hollow. It was the first time the Reich's air doctrine had acknowledged a battlefield space that could not be contested. Not far away, deep in the Ardennes, radar station X-27 tracked a single blip. High, fast, lone contact, likely a test flight. The operations captain made a call. Battery Charlie, single contact, bearing 31, altitude 18,000 feet, ready round, VT only. The loader reached into the crate with the reverence of a priest touching relics. He passed the shell down. The breech slammed shut. Gun 3 set. The officer gave the nod. The barrel fired once, recoiling with a cough of snow and smoke. 12 seconds passed, then a pulse of orange flickered in the distance. The radar confirmed, blip gone. The American front didn't celebrate. No cheers, no medals. These weren't fighter kills. There was no glamour in vaporizing someone you never saw. But every crewman knew what the shells meant. For the first time in the war, American infantry could sleep under open skies without praying for friendly aircraft. Because the sky didn't belong to fighters anymore. It belonged to the guns. The Luftwaffe's response came not in force, but in fear. Pilots now carried flares to warn ground gunners of their nationality, but it was useless. American gunners didn't see what they hit. The few who dared the sky developed rituals. One tapped the dash 3 times before takeoff. Another carried a photo of a crucifix carved from wreckage. Reinhardt visited the chapel. He didn't pray for victory. He prayed not to vanish. In March, a daring recon flight was ordered over Trier. 2 Ju-88s, low altitude, short range, a direct insult to the guns. They never returned. Search parties found one wreck in a forest. There were no holes in the fuselage, no burns. The wings were gone, ripped free. The shell hadn't hit. It had simply gotten close enough. Gibbs received a letter from home the same week. His sister wrote about spring coming early in Ohio, chores starting up. She enclosed a photo of the family tractor. He stared at the picture long after the mess tent emptied. That machine had fed his family for a decade, just like the one he now loaded fed death into the clouds. He set the photo inside his helmet, not because he needed hope, but because he needed to remember that not every machine was made to kill. American commanders took note of the kill logs. They were staggering. Some batteries averaged 1.2 enemy aircraft destroyed per round expended, an unheard-of figure in air defense. Requests for VT shells surged. Gibbs watched as trucks arrived hauling more crates than he'd ever seen. Engineers upgraded the Fire Direction Center with new computing units. Their 9-deam guns were now data-driven. Kill prediction, wind correction, elevation timing, all calculated before a round was ever fired. And the Germans kept flying into it. Near Cologne, a lone FW-190 made a desperate low-level run to photograph troop concentrations. It passed within 8 miles of 3 American radar grids. 3 shells were fired. One exploded 60 feet above the canopy. The aircraft pitched violently, the wings broke, the engine ripped free. The pilot ejected, but his chute failed. American infantry found the body the next day. A corporal said nothing. He just stared at the crater in the field and muttered, he never knew what hit him. Reinhardt finally received orders to evacuate his command, not to defend, not to relocate, to abandon. The Western Luftwaffe command was collapsing, and the VT shell, that tiny copper-ring device with a radar pulse inside, had killed not just pilots. It had killed belief. He left the airfield at dusk, took nothing but his logbook. When the wind hit his face, he looked once at the sky. There were no planes, no fire, but still he flinched. The sky above the Rhine grew quiet in March, not because the weather had turned or because the fighting stopped, but because there were simply fewer Germans left to fly. The Allies pressed eastward. Patton's tanks roared through shattered towns. Eisenhower's divisions crossed pontoon bridges under fire, and still, behind the ridgelines, the 90mm guns waited. The VT Fuzes hadn't stopped. They just had fewer targets. In a forward observation post outside Remagen, Sergeant Harold Gibbs stood beside the baseplate of Gun 2, looking downrange. The bridge had held. The Germans had tried everything: artillery, saboteurs, even jet strikes. But the jets hadn't made it past the Flak, not anymore. 3 Me-262s had screamed in low over the river 2 days ago, moving too fast for most gunners to even track. Gibbs didn't fire, his battery did. 4 VT shells went up. One exploded just behind the wing of the lead aircraft. It didn't matter. A near miss was still a kill. The plane folded mid-flight and spun into the river like a stone. On the German side, pilots refused to fly unless directly ordered. The veteran squadrons had been wiped out. New recruits were fed into cockpits with barely 6 hours of flight time. One young flyer, Oberfähnrich Kruger, wrote in his journal the night before a planned sortie. "They tell us we'll fly low, fast, under the flak envelope, but I've seen what happens when the sky opens. The American guns do miss. They don't blink, they just no." He flew the next morning. His group never reached the target. No remains were recovered. The official German reports stopped trying to explain the phenomenon. They simply called it unpredictable high lethality interception, a phrase that tried to sanitize what was really happening. Entire formations were being erased by shells that listened for them. It was no longer a war of tactics. It was a war of inevitability. At a rail junction near Koblenz, a Luftwaffe general watched from his staff car as wounded pilots were carried off a medical truck. 2 men were wrapped in bandages. Another was screaming not from burns, but from what he'd seen. His unit had flown into a corridor west of Limburg. They thought it was clear. No radar warnings, no flak spotted. The first shell detonated 5 seconds after they passed through the cloud ceiling. There were no black bursts, no dots in the air, just planes falling. He described the VT fuse as if it were alive, as if the sky had grown teeth. The American gunners began calling it the ghost ring. They never saw their targets, never looked up to aim. They fed coordinates, corrections, angles into the system, and the rounds did the rest. Gibbs didn't care for the nickname. He'd buried too many friends to romanticize what they were doing, but he understood the sentiment. It wasn't a gun anymore. It was a perimeter. A halo of judgment 30,000 feet wide. The last Luftwaffe raid in the West came on March 31, 1945. A force of 48 mixed aircraft, fighters and light bombers, tried to disrupt American rail supply routes near Frankfurt. 21 planes made it over the front. 16 were destroyed within 4 minutes. By the time the last bombs fell, only 7 aircraft were still flying, most of them trailing smoke, radios dead, crews stunned silent. 3 more crashed on the return trip. The raid had no tactical effect. No bridges were destroyed, no roads blocked. But it served a purpose. It marked the moment when the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force. Not because they ran out of planes, Not because they ran out of fuel, because they ran out of air. When Germany surrendered 5 weeks later, some American units had crates of VT shells they never fired. The sky had become too empty. Gibbs sat on the hood of a half-track and watched birds pass overhead. They flew in flocks again, free, unafraid. It felt unnatural. He unbuckled his field kit, took out one of the shells, inert, now deactivated. He turned it over in his hands. Brass steel, a tiny antenna no longer pulsing. This small, perfect machine had rewritten air warfare. It hadn't just killed aircraft. It had killed the very idea that altitude meant safety. In the post-war months, engineers in the States studied every report, every engagement, every shell. They called the proximity fuse one of the 3 most important weapons of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But it never made headlines. There were no parades for the gunners in the frozen fields, no ticker tape for the mechanics who wired radar fuses under canvas tents. Their victory was quiet, invisible, complete. Harold Gibbs returned to Ohio in the fall. The tractor still worked, the same one from the photo his sister sent him. He climbed into the seat and drove it across the field, staring up at a sky that now felt unrecognizable. There were no threats in it, no smoke trails, no wing formations. Only clouds, only wind. But sometimes, in the quiet between planting rows, he swore he could still hear the distant thud of a 9mm shell leaving the barrel. And the silence that came after,